My name is Larry, and welcome to another installment of the Old Gazer channel, which of course is dedicated to amateur astronomy. Specifically is intended to provide some advice and information and maybe inspiration to those who are beginning amateur astronomers, inexperienced astronomers who are looking for some help as they move along through the learning curve of this great hobby. That's what we're all about. And I hope this will be useful to you. Thank you so much for watching. And if this is your first video with me, welcome. If you're returning for another one, welcome back. And with that, let's get started. I want to do something a little different with this video. Instead of spending all the time talking about a specific topic or a specific item, I'd like to spend a little time just answering a few questions. Let's have some questions and answers, if you will. Most of these questions have come from comments or inquiries that I've got from people who have watched some or all of my videos. And I thought I might just take the opportunity from time to time to have one of these videos where we try to answer some questions or talk about some things that people have indicated an interest in. Most of these things being the sort of a thing that really don't require an entire video to talk about, but it's something that we need to be informed about. So that's the kind of thing this is going to be, just a few questions and answers. And so let's get right into that, shall we? Had an inquiry about someone wanted to know why their image is upside down when they look through their telescope. That's a very common question. I remember when I was a boy at 12 years old and got my first little telescope, the first time I looked through it, I was out experimenting with it during the daytime and doing a little terrestrial viewing. And I noticed right away that the objects I was looking at through that telescope were all upside down. So I simply took the eyepiece out and rotated it 180 degrees and put it back in there, and then I looked and that didn't help. I saw the same upside down image, and it took me a while to find information to answer the question as to why that was happening. Actually, inverting images or turning images upside down is something that's common to all lenses. Camera lenses invert images, which the camera then, turns right side up again. The human eye, the lens in the human eye actually produces an inverted image, which our brain is kind enough to translate into an upright image for us so that we can survive in this world out here. Well, it's no different with telescopes. Telescopes, by their very nature, because they have lenses and mirrors or some combination of the two inside, they turn objects upside down. So when we look at an object, we see an inverted image of that object. You can sort of tell why that's so by the way the light gets refracted or reflected within telescopes. It's always done at an angle. So light might come into the objective lens of a telescope up here. It's immediately refracted or bent like this and brought down. And you can see that eventually when it gets back here far enough, that part of the image that was at the top over here is going to be at the bottom over here. And conversely, the light that comes in here is going to get refracted up this way, and it's going to be at the top of the image. And so that's what inverts the image. Now, I think virtually all telescopes do produce inverted images, upside down images. Now, some telescopes, many refractors, for example, and just about all telescopes, such as this Schmidt-Cassegrainian back here, have a device known as a star diagonal, which is this. The light comes in here, and it hits a mirror here, and it's reflected up through the eyepiece, which is located right here, instead of passing through the back of the telescope. Now, the reason for that, I think, is pretty obvious. It's a lot easier to look down through an eyepiece in a telescope like this than it is to contort your body so that you could look up through the end of the telescope. So Telescopes who have a star diagonal like that, which includes many refractors and just about all Schmidt-Cassegrainian type telescopes, the effect of that extra mirror in there is to turn the object right side up. So you're going to see it, instead of being inverted, right side up. However, it also will create a mirror image of the object. You'll see that whatever object you're looking at as though you were looking at it in a mirror. It's going to flip it around, turn it around so that it looks the wrong way around. So that's what happens when you use a star diagonal in telescopes. Now, reflecting telescopes such as Dobsonians and other types of Newtonian reflectors, they're always going to produce an upside down image unless you go to some pretty extraordinary lengths to correct that. You can't really use a star diagonal or anything similar to that in a reflecting telescope because it messes up the focus. There are some focusing issues involved with that. So, so there you have it. Telescopes without star diagonals or something similar will always produce an image that is upside down. With a star diagonal, they will produce a right side up image that is, however, switched the wrong way around and produce a mirror image of whatever you're looking at. Now, cameras automatically correct for the inverted images that the lens produces, and our brain, thank goodness, is kind enough to change those inverted images that come through the lens of our eye and turn those upright so that we can make sense of things. So why not do that with telescopes? Can't you realign the objects in a telescope, change the orientation so that these things are right side up and the right way around? Yes, you can. But there's really very little need in doing that, and there is a potential problem with doing that. Okay? When you're looking at objects in the night sky, does it really matter what the orientation of that object is? That orientation is relative anyway. An object that's right side up in the northern hemisphere is going to be upside down in the southern hemisphere and vice versa. And, you can say accurately that in space there is no up and down. So there's no correct orientation when you're looking at objects in the night sky. I know I personally have never had any issue of, the orientation of objects that I look at through my telescope. It's just a non-issue with me. I'm only concerned about getting the best image that I can get through my eyepiece, and the orientation just is of no real consequence to me. There are some people who are really into astrophotography who take pictures and then pull them into a photo editor, and of course there they can create any orientation that they desire. They can make images right side up, right way around. They can make them upside down, wrong way around. They can rotate them in any fashion they want, and there would be nothing wrong in doing any of that because the perspective out in space is that there's no up and down. So I've always considered this to be a non-issue when I'm looking at objects in the night sky. I'm not concerned at all about what their orientation is. Now, if some of you are anal retentive and you just insist that things must look like what you would see if you looked up with your unaided eye into the sky, and you want to see that same thing in your telescope, you can get devices, I think they're called erecting prisms or something to that effect, which will, turn these objects, the quote, normal or correct orientation. But there is a potential price to be paid for that. First of all, anytime you introduce something else in the light path of the light coming through a telescope, you will reduce the throughput of light coming through that telescope and make the object less bright, less sharp, and just generally get degraded optical quality. And it also turns out that these devices that can be used to reorient objects, the images that come through the telescope, are the kinds of things that have a tendency to cause some kind of optical aberrations within the image, which is something you don't want. So, never been an issue for me. Hopefully it won't be for you either. But that's why things might look upside down or the wrong way around or both when you look through certain kinds of telescopes. And I hope that's an adequate answer for that question. I hope it wasn't too confusing. Let's move on. Someone has asked what the coatings on the lenses in eyepieces are and what their purpose is. Now let's talk about that briefly. When light passes through the eyepiece in a telescope, there's typically, several or at least two glass surfaces within that eyepiece. And when the when the light hits that glass, a part of it is going to be lost due to reflection. It's going to reflect somewhere within that eyepiece and not make it all the way through the end of the eyepiece into your eye. And that, of course, will reduce the light throughput coming through the eyepiece. So the purpose of these coatings that are put on eyepieces is to reduce the amount of reflected light that is lost when the light comes through the eyepiece of the telescope. They are called anti-reflective coatings, basically. Now, I'm not going to get into the chemical composition of these coatings or exactly how they work or whatever. You can research that all you want to. That would be beyond the scope of this little question and answer session. But let's talk just a minute about one aspect of these that might be of significance to you. Let's say that you're shopping for an eyepiece or trying to find information about an eyepiece. You will likely find on the list of specifications of that eyepiece something about the coatings that are on the glass surfaces within that eyepiece. If you see one that says fully multi-coated, that means that every glass surface and all the elements and all the groups in that eyepiece has been coated with this anti-reflective coating, and therefore, all other things being equal, those would be much better in allowing the most light to pass through to your eye and therefore produce a better image. So that costs more, of course, but if that's not a big issue for you and you're looking for eyepieces, you probably would want to look for those that say fully multi-coated. I hope that kind of answers that question. So with that, let's move on. Someone has asked, what is the correction time or the adjustment time associated with the telescope when you take it outside? What's that all about and how long is it? Well, I think I know what that question is getting at, and let's just get to the heart of it with an example. Let's say that you have your telescope inside in an environment where the temperature is 72 degrees. And let's say that you then take that telescope outside for a night of viewing. Let's say that it's in the winter and you're wanting to view the Orion Nebula. And so you're taking that telescope out into an environment that's, say, 35 degrees. So that's a big temperature differential, going from 72 degrees down to 35 degrees. Your telescope needs to be given time to adapt to the ambient temperature, the ambient conditions once you take it outside. Because until it reaches equilibrium temperature with its surroundings, there's going to be some contracting going on. There's going to be some heat radiating from your telescope and through the tube, which is going to create, heat waves in there. And so if you try to view objects before your telescope has had an opportunity to adapt to those lower temperatures, you're probably not going to get sharp and crisp and good images to look at. So you need to allow time for your telescope to come into balance with the ambient conditions that exist out there outside before you try to look through it. It works the other way too. Let's say you take your telescope from a 72 degree environment in a hot summertime out into a 95 degree environment. You need to give the telescope time to warm up to match the temperature of the conditions of the surroundings for the same reasons. Expansion within the telescope, air currents moving around within the telescope, that kind of thing, heat radiating from outside in is going to mess up your image a little bit. So that's why you need to give yourself an adjustment time before you start viewing through your telescope, just to let your telescope settle in and get to equilibrium with the outside conditions, especially with the temperature outside. So how long do you have to wait for that? Well, if the telescope is small and if the temperature differential is not too great between the inside and the outside, 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes is probably good enough before you can start viewing. If, on the other hand, you have a large telescope and the temperature differential, as in the first example we talked about, is pretty big, going from 72 down to 35 degrees, then it might require 40 minutes or perhaps even as much as an hour for that telescope to get fully adapted to those external conditions. And so, you should plan to take your telescope out there and set it up, and then perhaps do something else for a while until you've given it time to adapt to those ambient conditions before you start to view or image things through that telescope. So I hope that makes sense. Let's move on. Someone asked if they should take their safety and security seriously when they're outside at night viewing through their telescope. Yes, of course you should. Let me give you some personal perspective on this. Most of you won't have this issue of having to be concerned about how safe and secure you're going to be when you're out viewing through your telescope, because most amateur astronomers probably view from their backyards or their driveways or the balcony of their apartment, maybe even the roof of the building they live in or whatever. And so, that's a pretty safe and secure environment that you're comfortable with, and I'm sure you feel relatively safe and secure within. Then there are people like me who can't do their viewing at home. I'm surrounded by tall trees, and my driveway is likewise surrounded by tall trees. I simply cannot use my telescope to view the night skies from my home or my driveway. I have to go elsewhere. Now, fortunately, I've got a real sweet arrangement worked out. There's a pretty expansive open field that's less than a mile from where I live that has a pretty good view in all directions. And I have received permission to use that field. In fact, I'm allowed to go there anytime I want, and I'm allowed to stay as long as I want at all hours of the night, and no problem at all. It's also a smooth field that's kept mowed down for much of the year, so I can actually drive my car out into that field to the spot where I want to set the telescope up. So that makes setting everything up much easier when I can just take it right out of the car and set it up right there. So I've got a sweet deal up there. But it is away from my home, and it is in an area there's woods along two sides of this field. There are roads along the other two sides. So it's subject to people driving by, and subject to other people perhaps coming on the property, which has happened to me a couple of times. And so, it's a little bit different circumstance than viewing from the comfort and the safety and the security of your own backyard. I've had 3 or 4 incidents that have happened when I've been out viewing in that field that I didn't consider any danger to be involved. I didn't feel threatened by that. But these incidents were somewhat unsettling, if you will, and they kind of tampered my enthusiasm for that night's viewing, and in some cases cut that night's viewing short. I've encountered 2 people out in the middle of that field at late hours of the night, and they were people that you might have some concerns about, and I'll just let it go at that, and I'm not going to mention any specific details. Both of those situations turned out fine. There was no threat. There was no danger. But it was a little bit unsettling. You have to wonder, what are people doing out in the middle of a field, at 11 o'clock or midnight local time, just out in the middle of a big grassy field? And then I tell myself, well, I'm out there. Well, why shouldn't they be too? At any rate, there were those 2, briefly unsettling incidents that really posed no real threat. I did, however, have one incident that scared me very badly, and let me share that with you. I was out there in that field one night viewing something through my telescope, and all of a sudden I heard behind me and to the right a big commotion. And when I turned around to see what it was, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, 3 or 4 white-tailed deer came rushing by me at breakneck speed. I mean, they were galloping across that field, and they literally passed within 6 or 8 feet of where I was viewing through my telescope. I could pretty much feel the wind from them as they rushed by, and then they proceeded on down until they passed out of sight in the direction they were going. Well, that scared me. When they came rushing by there, my brain had not yet processed the reality that these are deer running past you here. I didn't know what it was for a while. In fact, that was the night when I decided that it might not be a bad idea to take an extra pair of underwear along in your kit when you go out viewing at night, if you know what I mean. But I watched those deer disappear, and then I turned around and started my viewing again, and all of a sudden, this thought popped into my head. What were those deer running from? Now, that put a damper on everything. I put all my equipment in the car, and I took myself home for the evening and decided to try again another night. So that was again, there was no real danger. That was just a very startling, frightening experience because I didn't know what was going on, and it took me a while to figure it out. So I guess you might encounter, if you're in a place that you're not familiar with, and if it's a little bit isolated or remote, there's always some possibility that you're going to encounter wildlife, or maybe even from time to time a person out there, and it has happened with me. But of all the times that I've been viewing in that field, nothing has ever really happened that I consider to be dangerous, just unsettling a little bit. Now, so the advice I would give you is this. If you are viewing in an area that's unfamiliar to you, maybe you've gone out to a dark sky area somewhere well away from your home, you're not familiar with it, maybe it's remote, maybe it's isolated, whatever. Should you be concerned about your safety and security if you're in an unfamiliar place, remote, isolated like that? Well, you've got to give it a little consideration, certainly. I would recommend taking a viewing buddy along with you if you can. 2 people out there are going to feel safer and more secure than just one. But if you can't do that, then you should at least try to maintain some minimal awareness of what's going on around you. I know it's hard to do. You're focused on finding an object in the night sky, getting your telescope on that object, and then study it, viewing it as it passes across the night sky. Very hard to think about anything else when you're so focused on that. But you need to try to maintain some minimal awareness of what's going on around you, and just common sense there. I would say that the odds of anything dangerous happening to you from wildlife or people when you're out viewing through your telescope is probably pretty slim. The chances are very remote. It could happen, certainly, but it's not very likely to happen, and you should not let that interfere with your plans to go out and view objects with your telescope. Chances are things are going to be fine, but just, maintain an awareness, a little bit of awareness of what's going on around you at all times. And don't forget to take that extra pair of underwear along in your kit. Okay, let's stop right there. I think 3 or 4 questions is probably enough for one video. Hopefully that addresses some of the things that some of my viewers have expressed an interest in or have a question about. We'll do this again from time to time. And just try to be informative about some things that are important, but not important enough to do an entire video about. I want to wrap this up by maybe giving you a few chuckles at my expense. I've commented a few times on these videos that I'm sometimes subject to having some senior moments for obvious reasons. But trust me, you haven't really seen any senior moments on these videos because I have that opportunity to edit these videos before they get posted up onto YouTube. And so you haven't really seen any serious old gazer senior moments yet because those have been edited out. But what I want to do now is I thought I'd show you a few outtakes. Now, you're not going to roll on the floor laughing at these probably, but you might get a couple of chuckles out of them. I sometimes find myself when I'm doing these videos just sort of freezing in place. Maybe I've forgotten what I meant to say next. Maybe I've forgotten how I wanted to deliver what I was going to say next. Maybe I have just remembered that I said something wrong earlier in the video and now I've got to figure out how to correct that. Sometimes I have dropped or almost dropped various pieces of gear. Uh, uh, Sometimes I've been distracted by other people or other circumstances, and that can cause some sort of frozen moments as well. And there have even been times when I have deliberately done some things in videos with every intention of including them in the video that gets uploaded to YouTube. But fortunately, when I get around to the process of editing that video before it's uploaded, my good judgment takes over and prevents me from uploading things that probably should not be part of the video. I'm going to show you at least one example of that and what's to come here as well. So I just thought I would show you some true examples of sometimes what happens when I'm filming or shooting these videos. And we'll close with that. Since we're going to close with that, let me take this opportunity before we start that to thank you very much for watching this video and to wish all of you clear skies and good viewing. And with that, let me present to you a few examples of old gazer senior moments. Use a light pollution filter. Pardon me, that's what you always want to do with your optics, right? This is called a catadioptric telescope. Now, that's too difficult for me to say, as you no doubt will appreciate after I've just tried to say that. So I'm just going to call it a compound telescope. Hello, length of the eyepiece. Okay, this is a 4 millimeter eyepiece. If you put that in a telescope with if you put a 10 millimeter eyepiece in the telescope, which I have one here somewhere, if you divide 350 by the magnitude of this eyepiece, now let's talk about something called asterisms. I got to pause here for just a second. Maybe it's just me, I don't know about you, but when I hear that word asterisms, the thing that comes to mind is more so, an idea of maybe a malady of one's nether regions instead of an astronomical term. I'm sure that's just me, but I just thought I'd mention that in passing. Normal exposures using quote normal cameras.